Principal Matters Podcast, episode 286. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. This week, I'm talking to Eric Garcia about his book, We're Not Broken. Eric Garcia is a Washington, D.C. based journalist focused on politics and policy, and currently the senior Washington correspondent for The Independent. His first book, We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, which the Washington Post called outstanding, was published in August of 2021. He previously worked as an editor at the Washington Post and The Hill, and as a reporter at Roll Call, National Journal, and Market Watch. His work has also been featured in The New Republic, The Daily Beast, Salon.com, and Spectrum. Eric Garcia, welcome to Principal Matters Podcast. I usually like to ask my guests, before I start asking questions about your content, to tell listeners something else they may be surprised to know about you.
So one of the I guess you could say the more surprising things is that I didn't always want to be a journalist. I wanted to be a musician. I talk about that in the book, and if you read a lot of the chapter names, they're named after songs, you know. And there was I got into journalism because my mom was kind of like, okay, buddy, you need to find something, you know, more stable than, you know, playing in a band. And then I was like, okay, I'll pick a more stable profession, journalism. So that's one. So yeah, that's, I guess you could say, kind of the fun fact is that I got into journalism through music. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to say some things to you and to our listeners to just disclose a little bit of the emotion that I had behind reading this book, because as a longtime educator, obviously I've worked with students with autism, but I have an adult daughter who's been diagnosed with autism as well. We actually read this book. We listened to the audio version of this together. So it's just such an honor to be in the room with you, Eric, and to hear the same voice that I heard narrating that entire book. But in your book, We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, you tell some gripping stories about your own journey with autism. Yeah. So can you describe what that experience was like for you, especially as a student? What that experience is like for you, especially when you were a student?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's a really important question. I think that what I should say is that, like, so I'm 31. So it's important to remember that I'm as old as the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And your listeners will know these laws very, very well. And how, even though I think that any educator will tell you that the letter of the law and the law in practice are two very different things. Mm-hmm. But I think it was really interesting because my generation, that generation of people who are now, I guess you could say, like, from like, I guess you could say like 27 to like 32 or 33, we were kind of the test run of that. Of disability education and integration. And it's important to remember that the IDEA was the first law that included autism as in disability education. Up until then, there was the Education for Handicapped Children Act. So I think it was, of course, when I was a kid, I didn't know this, you know, but in hindsight, it's interesting to watch because we were almost seeing a real-time test of what disability education for people on the autism spectrum and autistic people and otherwise neurodivergent people would look like. So I think it's really fascinating. But I think one of the things that was interesting is that in K-12, so I should say that, like, I went to public school from like fifth grade from like kindergarten to sixth grade. Then I went to private school because I was bullied a lot in public school. It wasn't because we were rich. My mom worked really hard so we could go to public school. And my dad did too, with, you know, paid child support, and my mom worked in retail. But like, I think it's interesting because I think that a lot of students have almost, if you get inadequate services, or if you're constantly fighting for services with IEPs and with you know, having to get a lawyer and getting all, you know, fighting tooth and nail with the school system and the school district, it can almost turn students off from asking for services once they head to college and head to university. So I almost like when I went to community college and then when I went to university, I just wasn't interested in asking for services at all because I was like, it's worth more trouble than it costs more trouble than it's worth, you know? So I was almost kind of like, I'm not interested in this. And it was really my mom who pressured me, like, you really need to do this when I was in community college. And then when I transferred, so I went to I went to community college. I went to Chaffey College before I went to university. And my mom really pressured me to do that, and I would recommend. I think community college is a great tool and resource especially for a lot of students with disabilities. And then I went to the University of North Carolina, and then when that was different because I was living across the country. I grew up in California, but then I went to North Carolina, and obviously I didn't have my parents on my monitoring my every move. So I almost just felt like, well, I don't really want to have an asterisk to my success. I think there is a big stigma, I think, around asking for services if you're a student with a disability, because then there's this feeling like, and this is why I'm not necessarily, it's not to denigrate any teacher who does this, but it's why I'm not a fan of the term special education or special needs, because I feel like it says like, oh, you're getting special treatment or you're getting preferential treatment. You're not. You're getting the tools so you can be on equal footing. So I think a lot of students, just by the term special, just avert it, and they don't want a target on their back, and they don't want to be stigmatized. So like that, I think it was just but what I realized was that I was kind of, first when I was at community college and then when I went to university, I was kind of drowning at first. I was really, like, help, how do I do this? And it wasn't until I bombed on a test when I was at the University of North Carolina, my first year at the University of North Carolina. I'll never forget, it was like the Friday before, the Thursday or the Wednesday before fall break. I went to my professor and I said, look, I'm on the autism spectrum. I don't like talking about it, but I need help. And I'll never forget it, is that my professor's name is David Peer. It was for a class I wasn't even a major in. It was a GE class. I needed to take an arts class. So I took the history of African music, which is so far out of my my sphere. But then, God bless him, I'll always remember, I'll always love him for this. He picked up the phone and called student services, and he said, they're waiting for you, go. I will always love him for that, because he could have very easily said, oh, well, this kid's just looking for an excuse. He didn't change my grade, mind you. I had to take that F and but he said, okay, we're going to do this. You're going to do this. I passed the class with a B minus, but because of that commitment, because of that phone call, that changed my life. And the same, so I think that what needs to happen is that you need educators to be willing to be empathetic, understanding, but that is such a rare case. And people like David Peer are the exception to the rule, sadly, a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, what I love so many things about that story, Eric, and one of the things that I love, and I think I told you this off the air before we started, was that when I remember listening to that specific part of your journey, and it brought me to tears, because your story before that, and you gave a very brief summary of what's in your book, you experienced a lot of emotional trauma. You experienced a lot of pain and learning and a lot of struggle. And yet you also had amazing strengths for the things that you're doing now, but finding someone who was able to figure out the right accommodations to match your strengths was so important. And that happened for you in that situation.
Absolutely. I don't think that I would be here today if it wasn't for professors like David Peer, professors like my other journalism professor, Farrell Gilroy. I'll never forget him. He retired like a year or two ago, but he was your classic Southern gentleman with like the pristine press shirts and the suspenders and the overalls and the spectacles. And he had this really heavy accent from Louisiana, but like, I'll never forget it. He was talking, like I had a class with him one time, and it was for my Southern politics class, because you had to write a column for this. It was a journalism class, and I remember I did okay on the assignment. My first assignment with him, I got a B minus, but like after I traded that assignment, and I remember just being kind of, once again, like, help. He said, come to my office, and I did. Like, it was right before class. He's like, I have a question, and he's like, do you have Asperger's? And on one end, that is Teachers, you are not, educators, do not do that. That is against the law. Like it literally is against the law. It's a violation of, what is it, FERPA?
Yes.
On the other end, thank God he asked that question. Because when he says, okay, I'm not going to help you with you. I'm not going to do your work for you, but he says, I'm going to help you narrow down the way you think. Because he says, I have loved ones who are on the spectrum, and that changed my life forever. And it taught me how to distill my ideas. And once again, it was an empathetic professor, and it was somebody who knew somebody, and it was somebody who had a fuller understanding that allowed me to succeed. So one of the things that I really try to emphasize in this book is, look, I've worked hard. I don't want to diminish any of my work, but hard work only gets you so far. Mm-hmm. There are tons of students who work harder than I do and who have worked harder than I do, who just couldn't get through college. We just couldn't get through, who couldn't get through high school, just because they didn't have the right supports. And I think it's really important to emphasize that, yes, we want to teach our kids grit and resilience, but on the other end, we also have to teach our educators empathy, and he did it to teach our administrators empathy. And I really do feel for teachers, administrators, things like that, because, again, not to get into too granular details, but your audience and listeners will know. But like the federal government has pledged that, okay, we're going to spend 40%. We're going to spend of the IDEA budgets. We're going to commit 40%. They've only ever spent about 14%. They only have ever contributed about 14, 15% in the past 30 years since IDEA. So like, I feel for local administrators, teachers, principals, things like that, because they have to do more with less. But in the same token and in the same respect, a lot of them don't even want to start that. What we need to do is we need to recognize that, yeah, we have a mutual interest. We should be, the federal government should live up to its promise. But, I think that a lot of people need to start from that baseline that my professors had, so that's important.
Well, what I love about your story also is just what you said earlier, the combination of understanding hard work, grit, resilience are important elements for getting a good job done. But empathy and compassion have to be married to grit and resilience in order to meet kids where they are. And as you think about your own experience, and this is one of the things that was so intriguing to me about the theme of your book, why is it so important for you as you advocate, not just from your own story, but for the stories of others? Why is it so important for you to help others understand that autistic people do not want you to always see them as broken? Talk about that for a minute.
So I don't even see myself as an advocate. I just see myself as a journalist who's telling people stories. And the thing that I wanted to start from the baseline was, we don't see deaf children as broken, failed. We see them as having a disability. Even I'm saying, for those who are listening, I'm looking at you right now. You have glasses. Glasses are an accommodation, but you have a disability. We do not try to force you to have normal sight and normal vision. You can have it if you want. You can have LASIK surgery. You can have whatever, but we don't take it as a given as, oh, you have glasses, so therefore you're a failed version of normal. Like right now, I'm giving you the perfect examples. Right now, I tore my ACL, so I had surgery about 2 weeks ago. But and a lot, but nobody's gonna tell me I can't use these crutches, Or if they do, they have a problem. People are going to say, you got a problem, buddy. But for whatever reason, for whatever rationale, and I go into the reasons of the rationales why in the book, is that we don't have that same approach with autism. Instead, we focus on saying these are failed versions of normal. These are kids who are damaged. These are kids who need to be fixed. And that winds up being stigmatizing, but it also leads us to solutions that just don't work. And I think that it's important that we start from the baseline assumption that every autistic student and every autistic person is fine as they are. That doesn't mean that they don't have challenges, that doesn't mean that they don't have impairments, all that, but it means that they're good, that they are not flawed as autism doesn't make them failed versions of humanity. And I think that needs to be the baseline assumption in any kind of education for autistic people. And I should say that goes for every disability as well. So,
Well, thank you for that clarification. And I think that's so important because you're right. At your age, you were the beginning of the conversations that were happening in schools around children that people didn't even know what to call the diagnosis. And even over time, as we've begun to find better services and accommodations for students, I think what I also loved about your book too was just kind of the narrative of here's been my experience as the student going through this process that we've all been watching nationally and internationally, that we've been able to distinguish some different categories on the spectrum. But sadly, there was a lot of misunderstanding and often misapplied understanding to students with autism. And you experienced some of that. And as someone now, as an adult who is in a thriving occupation, highly successful at the work that you're doing, you can now look back and see some things, I think, with perspective that can help educators to better understand how to encourage their students through whatever challenge they're facing.
And I mean, I have a lot of empathy for educators, and I have a lot of empathy for clinicians, especially because, so let's use the example. Let's just use a classic example is that I started to get the beginnings of what will eventually become a diagnosis in around 1994 when my mom saw an ad in the newspaper. We were living in Wisconsin at the time. There was an ad in the newspaper for like screenings for kids before they went into like preschool or something like that. So and that was 1994 was when Asperger's syndrome was included was first included in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it's interesting because initially they knew there was something there, but they didn't, there's always a lag in the language, just because something's put in, print doesn't, again, it takes time for people to adopt this and learn that, oh, this is what that is. And this is what this is. And it's funny because we see it change in real time. We see how it, for the longest time, then around 1998, 1999, I got diagnosed with what was then known as Asperger's syndrome. And then, at the same time, at that time, there were multiple diagnoses. There was autism disorder, there was pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. There were a lot of other ones. And then in 2013, they were all put under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And I think it's important to look at that and have that retrospective and have that context, because then we could say, okay, these were the things we did in the past. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. And then this is what's happening now. And I think that the difference now is that by virtue of the fact that a lot of kids just weren't getting diagnosed, and because autism was just so, and then even if they were getting diagnosed, it was such a stigmatizing diagnosis, that first generation didn't have a say in how autism was discussed. Now that generation, that 26, 27 to 33, 35 segment now can literally speak for themselves, now can literally advocate themselves, even if they, use a typing device, or whether they have a communication device, or they use sign language, or they, use their mouths. Whatever way, now they can communicate and they can advocate for themselves. And I think that is a big and monumental shift, because that wasn't something that was seen as possible for the longest time. I was reading when I was researching this book, I went back and I saw an old LA Times article about Temple Grandin's first book. It was a LA Times review, and it said the first recovered autistic adult, because people didn't think that adults could be autistic. That was in 1986. There are cars on the road that are older than that. The president of the United States is older than that. The vice president of the United States is older than that. So to give people context, these are really new ideas, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take work, because we have so much, we've learned so much misinformation, that countering that with better information, better knowledge, it's going to take just as long, if not longer.
Well, let's talk a little bit about in your experience too, because it's just so, I think it's always helpful to hear unique experiences. And I'm not saying your experience is going to mirror someone else's, but as an educator, I often like to ask this question too, which is, what specific accommodations helped you in your schooling, especially with someone who's with someone who has the strengths that you have, but also who had the struggles you have?
That's a really good question. So, like when I was in community college, I used to take tests, particularly math tests, and segregate. I literally had to go to like the student learning center, and there was this wall that was closed off. It was all windows, and I got extra time on my tests, and that helped miles. I only ever got like the best grade I ever got in math in community college was like a C in algebra and like a B minus in trigonometry, but like still, that was like still better than like what I otherwise would have gotten. And I think that's important to remember, because it allowed for because that worked. And that helped, because otherwise, even just the rustling of papers was just bad for sensory processing. Like especially when you're hypersensory, like a lot of autistic people, you need that. And then conversely, but like, again, that may not be the thing that other autistic people need. So I think it's very important that a lot of classes be adjustable. And I think another thing that's important to remember is that a lot of these accommodations that we give students, the house was already built before we had disabled students in mind. And it's almost like we're putting on an attachment afterward. And it looks very, very different. And it's important, I think, going forward to when we're thinking about class, when we're thinking about how we educate our children, how we educate our students, we should do it with disabled people in mind from the get-go. It's funny, I'll give an analogy. I should have given this analogy when I wrote the book, but like the perfect analogy is when my dad and I went to go when he dropped me off at the University of North Carolina. He was like, "Hey, let's go see how the other half lives." And we drove over to Duke. And one of the things that was interesting was that he was almost kind of, and he and I were both, and I'm not just saying this because I went to Carolina, but like we were almost so impressed because like my dad lives in Orange County, so a lot of people, wealthy, rich people who went to Duke, live in Orange County. And he'd heard everything beautiful about the campus. But then I remember he and I both having the same kind of opinion, which was, they don't really integrate the old buildings with the new buildings that well. You could tell that one was old, that there wasn't that perfect blend, or that it wasn't like they melded together well. And I think a lot of times in the same way, when it comes to educating disabled students with disabilities, a lot of times you can absolutely tell, oh, this was tacked on later. This wasn't, put on at the end. You can very, very much tell what the difference is.
Yeah. And I think one of the takeaways I like from that, Eric, is how do we design learning with all students in mind? And so one of the things that's coming to my mind as I'm thinking about school leaders who are listening to this conversation is, often I hear school leaders who are learning to include not just teachers, but parent voices and student voices in the leadership decisions they're making in their schools. But just as important, some of your students with disabilities, not just your gifted kiddos, but also your gifted kiddos who may not be, but maybe gifted kiddos who also have IEPs. And so I think it's just important that you have all voices as an opportunity to be heard through those experiences.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I really want is that, like, one of the things that's interesting to me is like, it was really like, I think a lot of educators thought it was weird. It was interesting. I was talking with Emra a minute ago, who you should have on this podcast today, are a autistic professor at the University of Michigan. You should absolutely have them on. But like, there's almost this assumption that if you are on a college campus, and you're disabled, that you must be extraordinary, or you must be better than you must not be like all those other disabled kids. When really, a lot of times it's chance, twist of fate, luck, that allowed you to they, a good teacher here, a good professor there, a good administrator there, what I would like is I would just like the ability so that, you don't have to be gifted to go to college. You don't, yeah, you work hard and yeah, but like you don't have to be extraordinary to go to university, to go to college, things like that. That is just a baseline assumption that, yeah, if you want, you can go to college. And again, I don't believe everybody needs a 4-year degree. My parents certainly didn't, but it shouldn't be like such an oddity that disabled students can, wow, go to university, wow, we can, get a job. Certainly not, I would love for it to just be such a normal assumption.
Well, something else that I really appreciated about your story too was your ability to understand how to leverage the things that you were really good at. For instance, your fascination or your interest in politics, your ability to really hone in on details and really spend a lot of time digging deeply into issues. All of those things you were able to eventually leverage into the work that you're doing today. So as you look back at some of those struggles that you wrestled with, and you see the flip side of that and how they actually contribute to your occupation, what encouragement might you have to others, to educators working with students that are still trying to figure out where they fit?
No, that's a really important question. That's a really good question. I think what I would say is that the advantages and disadvantages that I have as an autistic person should be seen as no different than the advantages and disadvantages that a neurotypical student has. My friend Steve Silverman puts it this way, and he wrote the book Neurotribes, which is he says that like just because an Apple operating system works different from a Microsoft operating system doesn't mean one is better than the other. It just means that there are pluses and minuses to the way an Apple operating system is, and there's plus and minuses to a PC operating system. And you might get one thing better than the other on all of them. It's a trade-off. But I think the baseline assumption, what educators just say is that neither of these neurotypes is better or worse. Rather, these are the things that they have. These are the pluses and the minuses of it. And how do we adjust accordingly? And how do we navigate accordingly? I think that's a better mindset, and it's a more productive mindset, because then what it does is it allows you to go in with the assumption that, okay, this person has abilities and this person has challenges. But then again, like the reason why I'm such an advocate for like including people with disabilities and different neurotypes is that this benefits neurotypical students as well. Because then once you realize that quote unquote normal students have pluses and minuses to the way that they learn, then you can recognize, okay, we should adjust to those challenges that they learn too. There's a benefit to recognizing different neurotypes to neurotypical people, just like in the same way that creating a curb cut is beneficial not only for people with wheelchairs, but also for parents pushing strollers, including different neurotypes. And keeping that in mind is a net plus for educators for neurotypical students as well as it is for neurodivergent students.
Mm. Well, the book is We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation with Eric Garcia. And Eric, I want my listeners to be able to connect with you and your resources. And I'd also like to give you an opportunity to share any additional thoughts that you might want to say before we wrap up today's conversation. So first, how can listeners connect with you and your resources if they want to learn more?
You can follow me on Twitter at Eric M. Garcia. That's Eric just with a C. You can follow me on Instagram. I post a lot of stuff about autism and disability, a lot more. I do a lot more of the political stuff because that's my day job. I use Twitter for my day job. I post a lot of stuff about autism on my Instagram. That's Eric M. Garcia 14. I'm always posting stuff about autism, posting stuff about, posting things that I find from other autistic people and other autistic educators and autistic influencers. So that's always a resource. You can buy my book wherever We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, wherever books are sold. The paperback edition is coming out on August 2nd of this year. So that is coming out as well. And you can always follow my work at The Independent. My columns at MSN. I also wrote a column for MSNBC, and I'd love to get in contact with you. So thank you very much for having me. I think the thing that I would like to say is that, like, I recognize that, like, my sister was a teacher for a long time. She's changing professions now. Like, teaching and educating and being an administrator, these are hard jobs, and I want to recognize that, and I want to be empathetic to that. And in the same respect, I want people to recognize that being a human being is also incredibly hard, and being a disabled person is incredibly hard. But what helps one often affects the other, and this improves both of our lives. So that's what I say.
Thank you, Eric Garcia. Well, Principal Matters listeners, I know that as you listen to this, you're going to want to connect with Eric's resources and his work. And Eric, I just want to thank you for the time that you've taken today to help us to learn more. And Principal Matters listeners, I hope that you have a fantastic week, because what you do matters. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
You can find free resources like this one at my website at williamdparker.com.